Sometimes the deepest loneliness comes not from being alone, but from believing you're unworthy of love. For 10 years, Isaiah has lived with that emptiness on his remote Montana ranch, convinced his past sins make him unfit for family or tenderness. Then 2 sisters arrive from Missouri with a simple proposition: give us sons, and we'll give you a home. What starts as a bargain becomes something none of them expected. 3 broken people learning that healing takes courage, that trust grows slowly, and that sometimes the family you choose is stronger than the one you were born into. But can 3 broken souls truly mend each other when the frontier tests every bond they try to build? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sun crested the Absaroka Mountains at 5:30, same as it had every morning for the past decade, casting long shadows across the valley floor where Isaiah Blackwood stood surveying his land. 6 feet 4 inches of weathered muscle and bone, he moved with the deliberate economy of a man who'd learned that wasted motion could mean death. His hands, scarred from cavalry sabers and ranch work alike, wrapped around a tin cup of coffee so black it might have been used to brand cattle. The ranch house behind him told the story of a man living, not thriving. Built solid from Montana pine and riverstone, it could have housed a family of 8 comfortably. Instead, it echoed with the footsteps of one lonely soul who ate standing at the kitchen counter and slept in a chair by the fire more often than in his bed. The front porch sagged slightly on the left side, victim of a winter freeze he'd never bothered to repair properly. What was the point? No one came calling anymore. Inside, tucked between the pages of his mother's worn Bible, pressed wildflowers from his first wife's grave had turned brown with age. He'd placed them there the day after Maria's funeral, along with his capacity for hope. Some wounds, Isaiah had learned, never properly heal. They just form thick scar tissue around your heart until you forget what it felt like to feel anything at all. The cattle lowed in the distance, calling him to the day's work. 300. Head of prime Angus, a decent living by any measure, though Isaiah ran the operation with half the hands most ranchers his size employed. Partly because he preferred solitude, mostly because he'd grown particular about the company he kept. Too many years watching good men die for bad reasons had left him skeptical of human nature in general. His horse, a steel-grey gelding named Flint, nickered a greeting as Isaiah approached the corral. The animal possessed the kind of steady intelligence that comes from years of partnership with a man who says more with his hands than his voice. Together, they'd check the north pasture fence, move the pregnant heifers closer to the barn, and pretend that the endless routine of ranch work could fill the hollow spaces where a family might have been. 2 states away, the Missouri dawn found Violet and Rose Ashworth pressed against the window of a lurching stagecoach, watching the prairie grass bend in waves toward the western horizon. They'd been traveling for 6 days, their worldly possessions reduced to 2 carpet bags, and a fierce determination to never again depend on a man's charity for survival. Violet, 24, and possessed of the kind of quiet strength that comes from protecting those you love, had arranged their correspondence with the Montana rancher through a matrimonial agency in Kansas City. Her penmanship was careful, her words chosen with the precision of someone who understood that hope could be a dangerous luxury. "We are prepared to work," she'd written. "We ask only for shelter, protection, and the chance to build something lasting." Rose, 2 years younger and gifted with the sort of beauty that had brought them nothing but trouble in Missouri, clutched their mother's quilting needles in her lap like talismans. The silver instruments had been in the Ashworth family for 3 generations, passed from mother to daughter, along with the knowledge that a woman's hands could create warmth and comfort even in the harshest circumstances. Their stepfather's death had freed them from his drunken rages, but left them with debts they couldn't pay, and a reputation that made respectable employment impossible. Rose's refusal to become the local banker's mistress had sealed their fate. They could flee west or face starvation in the streets of St. Louis. "Tell me again what you wrote to him," Rose murmured, her voice barely audible over the stage's rattling. Violet smoothed their single letter from Isaiah Blackwood, his careful script confirming their arrangement. "I told him we understood the terms. He provides protection and a home. We provide companionship and the possibility of children. It's honest work, Rose, no different than any other contract." But Rose's eyes held doubt. What if he's cruel? What if he expects things we're not prepared to give? Then we endure until we can find another way. Violet's jaw set, with the determination that had carried them through their stepfather's beatings and their mother's slow death from consumption. "We've survived worse men than a lonely rancher." The letter had been sparse on personal details. Isaiah Blackwood, age 38, owner of the Broken Creek Ranch in Paradise Valley, Montana Territory. Former cavalry officer, no living family, seeking companionate marriage with women of good character, willing to build a life on the frontier. The matrimonial agency had vouched for his financial stability and moral reputation, though they'd noted his preference for privacy and simple living. What the letter couldn't convey was the loneliness that had driven a man to seek wives through correspondence, or the desperation that had driven two sisters to answer such an unconventional proposal. These were details they'd all have to discover. Face-to-face, the stage stopped in Livingston for the night, and the sisters took a room above the saloon, listening to piano music and raucous laughter drift through the floorboards. Tomorrow, they'd catch the local stage to Paradise Valley, and by evening, they'd know whether their gamble would pay off or simply trade one form of uncertainty for another. In her narrow bed, Violet stared at the ceiling and thought about the hand-carved wedding ring she'd glimpsed in Isaiah's belongings photograph, clearly meant for a woman who'd never lived to wear it. Perhaps they were all haunted by the ghosts of might-have-beens. Perhaps that was enough common ground to build something real upon. Rose turned restlessly beside her. "Do you think he's handsome?" "I think handsome men have given us nothing but grief," Violet replied. "I hope he's kind." Morning brought the final leg of their journey, the stage climbing steadily into the mountains, until the air grew thin and sharp with the promise of early snow. Paradise Valley spread below them like something from a storybook, vast meadows dotted with cattle, the Yellowstone River threading silver through stands of cottonwood and pine, and everywhere the kind of space that made a person feel simultaneously significant and utterly small. The Broken Creek Ranch sat at the valley's northern end, a cluster of buildings that looked both substantial and somehow incomplete. Smoke rose from the main house chimney, and they could see a tall figure moving between the barn and corrals with the unhurried pace of a man comfortable in his own domain. "That must be him," Violet whispered, and Rose pressed closer to the window. Isaiah. Blackwood was larger than his photograph had suggested, his shoulders broad enough to fill a doorframe, his movements economical and sure. Even at a distance, they could sense the controlled power in his frame, the alertness of someone who'd learned to read danger in the wind's direction. The stage rolled to a stop in front of the house, and Isaiah approached with his hat in his hands, revealing dark hair threaded with premature silver and eyes the color of winter sky. His face bore the deep lines that come from squinting into sun and weather, and a scar along his left jaw spoke of violence survived rather than sought. "Miss Violet? Miss Rose?" His voice was deeper than expected, roughened by years of shouting. Orders over wind and gunfire. "I'm Isaiah Blackwood. Welcome to Broken Creek." The sisters climbed down from the stage with as much dignity as travel-stained dresses would allow, and for a long moment the three of them simply stood there, taking each other's measure. Here were three people about to enter into the most intimate of arrangements, with barely more knowledge of each other than what could be conveyed in carefully worded letters. "Your journey went well?" Isaiah asked, though his eyes had already catalogued their few possessions and drawn his own conclusions about their circumstances. "Well enough," Violet replied. "Thank you for meeting us." "I'll show you to the house," he said, shouldering their bags with an ease that reminded them both of his size and strength. "We can talk terms over supper, if that suits you." As they walked toward the ranch house, Rose stumbled slightly on the uneven ground, and Isaiah's hand shot out to steady her, a gesture so instinctive and gentle that it spoke well of his character. His touch lingered only a moment, but long enough for all three to feel the strange intimacy of their situation settling around them like morning mist. The house's interior surprised them with its cleanliness and order, though it had the sterile quality of a space maintained rather than truly inhabited. The kitchen was well appointed, the sitting room comfortable but impersonal. Only the study showed signs of regular use: books on animal husbandry and weather patterns, a desk covered with ranch accounts, and on the mantel a daguerreotype of a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. "My first wife, Maria," Isaiah said simply, noticing their glance. "She died of fever our second winter here." The sisters exchanged a look, understanding now some of the sorrow that seemed to follow Isaiah like a shadow. They were being asked to fill a space left by genuine love lost, not merely to provide convenience for a confirmed bachelor. "She was beautiful," Rose said softly. "She was good," Isaiah replied, and somehow that simple statement told them everything. They needed to know about both the dead woman and the man who mourned her. The first week passed in careful politeness, all three of them dancing around the edges of their arrangement, like barn cats circling a water dish. Isaiah had given the sisters the 2 bedrooms upstairs, while he moved his belongings to a room off the kitchen that had once served as a pantry. The gesture spoke of consideration, though it did nothing to ease the awkwardness that settled over their meals like dust. Violet threw herself into domestic tasks with fierce determination, scrubbing floors that were already clean and reorganizing cupboards with military precision. Rose proved more tentative, her hands shaking slightly as she prepared their first breakfast, hyper-aware of Isaiah's presence at the kitchen table. He ate without comment, neither praise nor criticism, leaving them to guess whether their efforts met with approval. The house itself seemed to exhale with relief at having voices within its walls again. Rooms that had echoed with solitary footsteps now hummed with feminine conversation and the rustle of skirts on wooden floors. But underneath the surface normalcy, questions lingered unspoken. When would Isaiah exercise his marital rights? How would they divide his affections? What happened when winter came and the close quarters made privacy impossible? It was Rose who discovered the daguerreotype, tucked behind a stack of agricultural journals in Isaiah's study. She'd been dusting the shelves when the leather portfolio slipped from her hands, spilling its contents across the floor. Along with cattle breeding charts and correspondence with livestock dealers, she found a photograph unlike the formal portrait on the mantel. This image showed Isaiah perhaps 15 years younger, his arm around a woman heavy with child, both of them laughing at something beyond the camera's view. Another man stood beside them, younger still, with Isaiah's same strong jaw and clear eyes. At the bottom, in faded ink, Isaiah, Maria, and baby Samuel, Thomas Blackwood, summer 1869. "Rose, what are you—" Violet appeared in the doorway and stopped, seeing the photograph in her sister's trembling hands. "He had a child," Rose whispered, "and a brother." The sound of boots on the front porch sent them both scrambling to restore the study to order, but Isaiah's keen eyes immediately noticed the shifted papers and their flushed faces. His gaze fell on the daguerreotype still clutched in Rose's fingers, and for a moment his face went completely blank. "I'm sorry," Rose stammered. "I was cleaning and it fell. I didn't mean to pry—" "No." Isaiah's voice came out harsh, then gentled with visible effort. "No, it's your home now, too. You have a right to know what manner of man you've bound yourselves to." He took the photograph with hands that weren't quite steady, studying the faces of his lost family as if seeing them for the first time in years. The silence stretched until Violet found the courage to speak. "Will you tell us about them?" Isaiah sank into his desk chair, suddenly looking every one of his 38 years, and several more besides. Samuel was born early that winter, lived 6 days, his thumb traced over the child's image. Maria never recovered from the birth. The fever took her 3 weeks later. And your brother? Violet's voice was barely audible. Thomas died at Little Bighorn. 7th Cavalry, same as me, though he stayed when Isaiah's jaw worked silently. For a moment. He stayed when I left the service. The weight of his losses settled over them, like a physical presence. Here was a man who'd buried his wife, his child, his brother, perhaps his faith as well. No wonder he'd sealed himself away from the world, choosing isolation over the risk of further heartbreak. Rose moved closer, her natural compassion overcoming her shyness. I'm sorry. We lost our parents young too, but not like that. Not all. At once. Grief is grief, Isaiah replied. Some folk weather it better than others. Some folk don't have to weather it alone, Violet said softly. Isaiah looked up at her, something flickering behind his careful reserve. Is that what we're doing here? Sharing the load? I thought we were making a bargain, Violet replied, but perhaps it could be something more. The conversation was interrupted by the first real storm of autumn, wind howling down from the mountains with a fury that shook the house's sturdy frame. Rain lashed against the windows, and by evening the temperature had dropped 20 degrees. Isaiah checked the stock twice, returning soaked and grim, with reports of fence damage and scattered cattle. Bad one, he muttered, toweling his hair by the fire. Could lose some of the herd if they drift too far south. Without discussion, the sisters began preparing for siege. Violet filled every available container with water, while Rose banked the fires and moved food supplies closer to the kitchen. They worked with the efficiency of people who'd weathered crises before, their movements coordinated, despite weeks of polite distance. When the lights went out, the wind having torn down the power line from town, Isaiah produced oil lamps and candles with the same calm competence. By lamplight, the three of them looked like figures from an earlier century, pioneers huddled against the wilderness's fury. How long will it last? Rose asked, jumping as thunder crashed overhead. Could be hours, could be days, Isaiah replied. Mountain storms make their own rules. They moved into the sitting room, drawn together by the warmth of the fireplace and the illusion of shelter it provided. For the first time since their arrival, conversation came naturally. Isaiah shared stories of other storms weathered. The sisters described the tornadoes that regularly swept across Missouri's plains. The shared experience of nature's power created an intimacy that weeks of careful politeness had not achieved. In Missouri, we'd sleep in the root cellar when the weather turned ugly, Rose said, curled in her chair like a cat seeking warmth. No root cellar here, Isaiah observed. Ground's too rocky, but the house has weathered worse than this. As if, to test his words, another gust of wind sent something heavy crashing against the north wall. All three jumped, then laughed nervously at their reaction. Perhaps we should stay together tonight, Violet suggested, in case the roof decides to take leave. Isaiah nodded toward the sitting room's large sofa. I'll bed down here. Keep the fire going. But when Rose shivered despite the flames, and Violet admitted she'd never slept well during storms, practical considerations overrode propriety. They arranged blankets and pillows on the floor before the hearth, close enough to share warmth, but far enough apart to preserve some semblance of decorum. In the flickering firelight, with the storm raging outside, they looked like what they were slowly becoming, three people learning to depend on each other. Isaiah's presence no longer felt like an intrusion, and the sisters' voices no longer seemed like interruptions to his solitude. What will you call us? Rose asked suddenly. I mean, when we're married proper. Mrs. Blackwood seems strange when there's two of us. Isaiah considered this. I suppose you'll still be Violet and Rose to me, unless you'd prefer otherwise. I'd like to keep my name, Violet said. At least partly. Violet Ashworth Blackwood has a nice sound. Rose Ashworth Blackwood, Rose tested. The words, "Yes, I like that too." The conversation drifted into silence, broken only by the storm's fury and the fire's gentle crackling. But it was a comfortable silence now, the kind that comes when people stop performing for each other and simply exist in the same space. Just before dawn, the wind finally died, leaving behind a cathedral quiet, broken only by water dripping from the eaves. Isaiah woke first, finding himself oddly reluctant to disturb the peace they'd found in crisis. Rose had rolled closer to the fire during the night, one hand stretched toward its warmth. Violet slept with the alertness of someone who'd learned to wake at any sound, but her face held a serenity that spoke of deep rest. For the first time in years, Isaiah had slept through the night without nightmares. Perhaps there was something to be said for shared watch after all. The storm's aftermath revealed both damage and opportunity. 2 sections of fence lay twisted on the ground, but no cattle were lost. The barn's roof had shed some shingles, and the vegetable garden looked like a battlefield. But the house stood, firm. More importantly, the crisis had stripped away the last pretense of formal distance between them. Isaiah found Rose in the sitting room the morning after, holding the pieces of a broken harmonica she'd discovered beneath the sofa. The instrument was old, its silver plating worn away in places, the wooden comb cracked but not beyond repair. "I'm sorry," she said, looking up with stricken eyes. "I was cleaning up from last night and found it broken. I must have rolled onto it during the storm." Isaiah knelt beside her, taking the pieces with gentle hands. "This was my father's. He played it during cattle drives when I was a boy." His voice held no anger, only a distant sadness. "I haven't touched it since he died." "I could try to fix it," Rose offered hesitantly. "Back home I mended instruments for the church. It's delicate work, but I have steady hands." Something shifted in Isaiah's expression as he studied her earnest face. "You'd do that, if you'd like me to try?" He nodded, placing the broken pieces in her palm with a trust that felt significant beyond the gesture itself. "I'd forgotten he used to play Sweet Betsy from Pike when the nights got cold." Rose smiled. "I know that one. My father taught it to me." The repair became Rose's project over the following days, her nimble fingers working with tiny tools borrowed from Violet's sewing kit. She labored in the good light by the kitchen window, tongue pressed between her teeth in concentration, while Isaiah watched with growing fascination. Her patience seemed infinite, her touch reverent, as if she understood she was mending more than just an old instrument. Meanwhile, the ranch demanded attention. Isaiah began including both sisters in the daily rounds, initially out of necessity, but increasingly out of recognition for their capabilities. Violet proved unexpectedly strong, able to wrestle a gate latch that had challenged men twice her size, while her quick mind grasped the intricacies of cattle rotation and pasture management. Faster than some hands with years of experience. "You could run this place yourself if you had to," Isaiah observed, after watching her efficiently separate a lame steer from the herd. "I've been watching you," Violet replied, coiling rope with practiced ease. "The work's not so different from managing a household, just on a larger scale." Rose's contributions were more subtle, but equally valuable. Her gentle manner calmed skittish animals, and her attention to detail caught problems before they became crises. She noticed when a cow favored one leg, when water troughs ran low, when gates had been left unlatched. Her domestic skills transformed, their meals from sustenance into genuine pleasure, and her quiet presence seemed to settle everyone's nerves. The harmonica repair took nearly a week, but when Rose finally reassembled the pieces and tested each note, the sound that emerged was clear and sweet. She played a tentative version of Sweet Betsy from Pike, then looked up to find Isaiah's eyes bright with unshed tears. "It sounds just like he did," Isaiah said roughly. "Thank you." That evening, after supper and chores, Rose played while they sat by the fire, Her repertoire included hymns and folk songs, dance tunes and lullabies, each melody carrying them to different places and times. Isaiah listened with an expression of wonder, as if music was something he'd forgotten existed. "Play something happy," Violet requested, curled in her favorite chair with mending in her lap. Rose launched into a spirited version of Turkey in the Straw, and Isaiah surprised them both by humming along. The sound was rusty but true, evidence of a voice trained by cavalry songs and cowboy ballads. "You should sing more often," Rose told him when the song ended. "Haven't had much reason to," Isaiah replied, but his tone held possibility rather than finality. Their first trip to town together came at the end of the month, when supplies ran low and social obligation demanded their appearance at the general store. Isaiah hitched up the wagon, and the sisters donned their best dresses, modest but well-made garments that spoke of genteel poverty rather than true destitution. Paradise Valley's main street stretched for 3 blocks, anchored by the general store, a saloon, the church, and a handful of other businesses that served the scattered ranching community. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, and the arrival of Isaiah Blackwood with 2 young women caused considerable stir. The store's owner, a rotund man named Harvey Clemens, greeted Isaiah with cautious friendliness. "Blackwood, heard you had visitors." "My wives," Isaiah said simply, his hand settling protectively on Rose's elbow. "Violet and Rose Ashworth Blackwood." The announcement caused a ripple of whispered conversation among the other shoppers. Mail-order brides were common enough on the frontier, but plural marriage raised eyebrows even in liberal Montana territory. Mrs. Adelaide Kemper, the banker's wife and unofficial arbiter of local morality, approached with the predatory smile of a woman scenting scandal. "How fascinating. 2 wives. However do you manage the domestic arrangements?" "Same as anyone manages their household, I expect," Violet replied smoothly, her chin lifting with quiet dignity. "Through mutual respect and shared purpose." "But surely the church has married us according to territorial law," Isaiah interjected, his tone brooking no further discussion. "I believe you'll find everything quite proper, Mrs. Kemper." The lie came easily, though they hadn't yet formalized any marriage arrangements. But Isaiah's protective instincts had kicked in at the first sign of hostility toward the women who'd trusted him with their future. The shopping proceeded under a cloud of barely concealed curiosity and judgment. Other women gathered in small groups, voices lowered, but eyes sharp. The men were more circumspect, but equally interested, stealing glances at the sisters while pretending to examine hardware and horse tack. It was young Tom Mitchell, barely 18 and full of the confidence that comes with being the banker's son who pushed too far. "Afternoon, ladies," he said, tipping his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "I'm Tom Mitchell. If you ever find ranch life too lonely, I hope you'll remember that civilized company can be found in town." The insult was subtle but unmistakable, a suggestion that Isaiah's wives might be available for other arrangements. Isaiah stepped forward, his bulk blocking Tom from the sisters' view. "I believe you have business elsewhere, son," Isaiah said quietly, but the threat in his voice was unmistakable. Tom's bravado evaporated in the face of Isaiah's cold stare. He mumbled an apology and retreated to his father's side, leaving the sisters with a clearer understanding of their precarious social position. The ride home was subdued, all 3 processing the encounter and its implications. They were bound together now, not just by legal arrangement, but by the knowledge that the outside world viewed their relationship with suspicion at best, hostility at worst. "I'm sorry," Isaiah said finally. "I should have prepared you better for how folk might react." "We've faced worse," Violet replied, though her voice held a tremor of uncertainty. "Together," Rose added firmly, and Isaiah felt something warm unfurl in his chest at the word. October brought the first serious cold snap, sending them scurrying to prepare for winter's approach. The sisters had begun a quilting project, their mother's silver needles flashing in the lamplight as they stitched together scraps of fabric into something beautiful and practical. Working side by side in the evening, they shared stories of their childhood, their parents, their dreams for the future. "Mama always said a quilt tells the story of the woman who made it," Rose murmured, threading her needle with a piece of blue calico from her old dress. "Every scrap has a memory." Violet held up a square cut from Isaiah's worn work shirt, fabric he'd given them freely when they mentioned their project. "Then this one will remember the day he taught me to rope a steer." Isaiah, working on ranch, accounts at the kitchen table, listened to their quiet conversation with something approaching contentment. The sound of feminine voices, planning and remembering, filled corners of his heart he'd thought permanently sealed. Maria had quilted too, though her work lay unfinished in the cedar chest upstairs, another ghost he wasn't ready to face. "What will you put in the center square?" he asked, surprising himself by joining their conversation. The sisters exchanged a meaningful look. "We thought perhaps something from all three of us," Violet said carefully. "If you'd like to contribute." Isaiah considered this, then disappeared into his study. When he returned, he carried a small piece of blue wool, the remnant of his cavalry uniform, carefully preserved despite the painful memories it carried. "From my old life," he said simply, handing it to Rose. "Maybe it's time it became part of something new." Their fingers brushed as she took the fabric, and neither pulled away immediately. The touch was brief but electric, acknowledgement of the growing attraction that simmered beneath their carefully maintained propriety. The attraction was becoming harder to ignore. Isaiah found himself lingering over breakfast to hear Rose hum, while she worked, stealing glances at Violet's capable hands as she mended harness leather. The sisters, meanwhile, had begun competing for his attention in subtle ways. Rose with her gentle touches and sweet smiles, Violet with her quick wit and fierce competence. The tension came to a head during a blizzard that struck without warning. In early November, Isaiah had been checking the north pasture when the storm descended, and he barely made it home through the driving snow. He arrived half-frozen, his lips blue and hands numb with cold. Both sisters descended on him immediately, Rose pulling off his boots, while Violet wrapped him in blankets and fed him whiskey by the spoonful. Their care was efficient but intimate, hands working over his chilled body without shame or hesitation. When Rose chafed his frozen fingers between her palms, her touch sent warmth racing through him that had nothing to do with circulation. "You could have died out there," Violet scolded, her voice sharp with fear. "What would we have done then?" "Managed, I expect," Isaiah replied, but his voice lacked conviction. The truth was, he no longer wanted them to manage without him. Somewhere along the way, their arrangement had become something more personal, more precious. That night, with the wind howling and the temperature dropping towards zero, practical. Considerations overrode propriety once again. The house's heating was uneven at best, and the upstairs bedrooms turned arctic when the wind was right. Without discussion, they made a nest of quilts and blankets in the sitting room, close enough to share warmth and watch over each other. Isaiah lay between the sisters, hyper-aware of their breathing, their scent, the rustle of fabric when they shifted in sleep. Rose's hand had found his during the night, her fingers twined with his in unconscious trust. Violet slept with one arm flung across his chest, her face peaceful in the firelight. For a man who'd spent 10 years in solitude, their presence should have been overwhelming. Instead, it felt like coming home. Morning brought practical concerns that temporarily pushed aside emotional complications. The storm had drifted snow against the barn doors, trapping the stock inside without food or water. Isaiah and Violet worked together to clear the drifts, while Rose prepared hot food and coffee to warm them when they came inside. It was during this crisis that Violet's hidden talent emerged. Struggling with the ranch's bookkeeping, complicated by storm damage and unexpected expenses, Isaiah admitted he'd never been good with figures beyond basic arithmetic. "Let me see," Violet said, settling beside him at the kitchen table with the ledger books. Within an hour, she'd reorganized his entire system, identified discrepancies in supplier billing, and calculated potential savings that made Isaiah's head spin. Her handwriting was clear and precise, her mathematical skills impressive for anyone, remarkable for a woman of her background. "Where did you learn this?" he asked, amazed. "Our father was a bookkeeper before he died," Violet explained. "He taught me because he said a woman who could manage numbers would never be completely helpless. I kept the accounts for our stepfather's store, not that he ever thanked me for it." "I'll thank you," Isaiah said earnestly. "This is the clearest the books have been since Maria." He stopped abruptly, color rising in his cheeks. "Since your first wife died," Violet finished gently. "It's all right to speak of her, Isaiah. She's part of your history, part of what brought you to us." The mention of Maria created an awkward silence that Rose filled by announcing supper ready. But as they ate, Isaiah found himself comparing his wives, not in judgment, but in gratitude. Maria had been sweet and yielding, content to follow his lead in all things. These women brought different gifts: Violet's fierce intelligence and protective strength, Rose's nurturing warmth and artistic soul. He was beginning to understand that love didn't have to be rationed, that his heart might be large enough for multiple devotions. The realization terrified him. It was Rose who noticed his withdrawal, the way he'd begun finding excuses to work. Late in the barn or ride fence lines that didn't need checking. She confronted him one evening as he lingered over unnecessary paperwork, clearly avoiding the warmth and intimacy of the sitting room. "Are we crowding you?" she asked directly. "Because if this isn't working..." "It's working too well," Isaiah admitted, his pen stilling on the page. "I don't know how to be what you need me to be." Rose moved closer, her hand settling on his shoulder with gentle pressure. "You don't have to be perfect, Isaiah. You just have to be willing." "Willing to what?" "To let us love you," she said simply, "and to love us back, if you can." The conversation was interrupted by Violet calling from the kitchen, a neighbor's lantern approaching through the darkness. They had visitors, and at this hour in this weather, that likely meant trouble of one kind or another. The visitor proved to be Marcus Webb, their nearest neighbor, his face grim beneath his snow-crusted hat. Webb ran cattle on the land adjoining Broken Creek's eastern boundary, and while he and Isaiah maintained cordial relations, they'd never been close friends. "Evening, Blackwood," Webb said, accepting the cup of coffee Rose pressed into his hands. "Sorry to trouble you so late, but I wanted to speak with you before word gets around town." Isaiah gestured toward the sitting room, but Webb shook his head. "Best if the ladies hear this too, seeing as it concerns them." The sisters exchanged worried glances as they settled around the kitchen table. Webb's expression suggested the news wasn't good. "Had a visitor today," Webb continued. "Fellow from back east, asking questions about your household arrangements. Seemed mighty interested in the legal aspects of your marriage situation." Isaiah's jaw tightened. "What kind of fellow?" "Called himself a journalist, though I had my doubts. Too well dressed for a newspaper man, too interested in private matters for someone just writing stories." Webb paused, studying Isaiah's face. "He knew things, Blackwood. Knew your wives came from Missouri, knew about the correspondence through the matrimonial agency. Someone's been talking, and not just idle gossip." Violet felt her stomach drop. "What did you tell him? Nothing useful, I hope." "Told him I minded my own business and suggested he do the same." Webb's expression darkened. "But he's asking around town too. Kemper's been spreading tales about polygamy and immoral arrangements. There's talk of bringing in territorial authorities." The implications hung heavy in the air. Polygamy was illegal, under territorial law, and while their arrangement might be unconventional, they weren't actually practicing plural marriage, yet. But public perception could be as damaging as legal reality, especially for women whose reputations were there. "Only protection." "There's more," Webb said reluctantly. "This journalist, he had a photograph. Old military picture, looked like cavalry unit. Asked if I recognized anyone besides you." Isaiah went very still. "Did you?" "Might have. Fellow in the back row looked familiar, but I couldn't place where I'd seen him. Webb finished his coffee and stood. Just thought you should know. Whatever trouble you might have left behind seems like it's catching up. After Webb departed, the three of them sat in heavy silence. The peaceful domesticity they'd been building felt suddenly fragile, threatened by forces beyond their control. "Is there something else you haven't told us?" Violet asked finally. "Something that would bring investigators all the way from the east?" Isaiah was quiet so long they thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "There are things about my military service that some people prefer to forget, things that might embarrass certain officers, if they came to light." "What kind of things?" Rose pressed gently. "The kind that get you court-martialed if you refuse to forget them," Isaiah replied. "The kind that make you enemies in high places." He stood abruptly, pacing to the window to stare out at the snow-covered yard. "There was an incident during the Indian campaigns. Orders came down that I couldn't follow. When I tried to report what I'd witnessed, I was told to keep quiet for the good of the service. When I wouldn't, they found other ways to silence me. That's why you left the cavalry," Violet guessed. "That's why they threw me out," Isaiah corrected bitterly. "Conduct unbecoming, they called it. Truth was I'd become inconvenient." Rose joined him at the window, her hand finding his arm. "What did you see that they wanted hidden?" "Massacre," Isaiah said simply. "Women and children mostly. Peaceful Indians who'd been promised safe passage. My commanding officer gave the order to fire anyway." His voice turned hollow. "I tried to stop it, tried to protect who I could. For my trouble, I was branded a traitor and discharged in disgrace." The sisters absorbed this revelation in silence. Here was the source of Isaiah's self-imposed exile, his belief that he was unworthy of love or family. He'd sacrificed his career and reputation to protect innocent lives, only to be punished for his conscience. So now they're worried you might tell that story to a journalist, Violet said, understanding dawning. "Seems likely." Isaiah turned from the window, his face etched with weary resignation. "Which means trouble for all of us. They won't hesitate to destroy you to get to me." But instead of the fear he expected, Isaiah found fierce determination in both sisters' faces. Rose straightened her shoulders, her gentle nature hardening into protective steel. Violet's chin lifted with familiar stubbornness. "Then we face it together," Violet said simply. "All three of us." "You don't understand." "No, you don't understand," Rose interrupted, surprising him with her vehemence. "You think we came here because we had other choices. You think we'd abandon you at the first sign of trouble. But we're not going anywhere. Isaiah, this is our home now, our family. Whatever comes, we handle it together." The conversation might have continued, but it was interrupted by a discovery that changed everything. While cleaning the study the next morning, Rose found a small silver locket tucked behind some books, clearly fallen from its hiding place during their recent reorganization. Inside were two tiny portraits, a man and woman with kind faces and Rose's same delicate features. On the back, in faded script, "Mother and Father, 1854. "It's them," Rose whispered, showing Violet the precious find. "I thought we'd lost everything in the fire." "You had a fire?" Isaiah asked, drawn by their excited voices. "Our stepfather burned most of our belongings when he drank," Violet explained. "Said we had too much that reminded him of our real parents. We thought all the photographs were gone. The locket represented more than just recovered memories. It was a sign that some things lost could be found again, that the past didn't have to be a source of pain alone. Perhaps their parents' love could be recovered just as surely as their images." That evening, emboldened by the day's revelations and the growing intimacy between them, Isaiah made a decision that had been building for weeks. After supper, as they settled by the fire for their usual quiet time, he cleared his throat nervously. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began, looking at each sister in turn, "about facing things together, about being willing to let you love me." Both women gave him their full attention, sensing the importance of whatever he was struggling to say. I can't promise I'll be easy to live with. Can't promise my past won't bring danger to your door. But I can promise that if you'll have me, truly have me, not just as protection but as husband, I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of that trust." The proposal hung in the air between them, more intimate and meaningful than their original business arrangement. This wasn't about convenience or survival, this was about choosing each other despite the risks. Rose was the first to respond, rising from her chair to kneel beside his. "I'd be honored to be your wife, Isaiah Blackwood, truly and completely." Violet's answer came in the form of action rather than words. She moved to his other side, taking his free hand in hers and lifting it to her lips for a gentle kiss. "When?" was all she said. But it was enough. The next morning brought Isaiah to the kitchen table with a legal document that made both sisters' hearts race with possibility and terror in equal measure. The ranch's deed, worn from handling but still legally binding, lay spread before them, like a map to their future. "I want to add your names," Isaiah said without preamble. "Joint ownership, full legal rights. Whatever happens to me, this place belongs to you." Violet stared at the papers, understanding their significance. Property ownership meant security, independence, the right to make their own choices. For women in their position, it was a gift beyond price. "Isaiah, you don't have to—" "Yes, I do." His voice carried quiet conviction. "Maria never had legal claim to this place. It was my oversight, my assumption that we'd have years to worry about such things. I won't make that mistake again." Rose traced the deed's borders with one finger, following the property lines that encompassed thousands of acres of rich grazing. "Land. What if people say we married you for this, for the money and land? Let them say what they will," Isaiah replied. "We'll know the truth." The truth, however, was becoming complicated in ways none of them had anticipated. The marriage arrangements they discussed in abstract terms suddenly required practical decisions that exposed the delicate negotiations of desire, duty, and emerging affection. The territorial judge would need to perform the ceremony in Livingston, a 2-day journey by wagon. Local arrangements would require careful handling to avoid further scandal. And then there was the question of their sleeping arrangements afterward. A topic that brought color to all their cheeks and made conversation stilted with unspoken possibilities. It was Violet who addressed the elephant in their parlor with characteristic directness. "We need to discuss how this will work," she said one evening, as they prepared for another night of shared warmth by the fire. "All of us sleeping together, I mean. After we're married proper." Isaiah cleared his throat uncomfortably. "I don't expect, that is, I won't demand anything you're not ready to give." "But you hope," Rose said softly, "for children eventually, for a real family." "I hope," Isaiah admitted, "for whatever grows naturally between us. I won't force intimacy, but I won't pretend I don't want it either." The honest admission hung between them, acknowledgement that their arrangement was evolving beyond mere convenience toward genuine desire. The physical awareness that had been building for months could no longer be ignored or dismissed as practical necessity. Their conversation was interrupted by unexpected visitors, a delegation from town led by Reverend Matthews, the elderly minister, who served Paradise Valley's small congregation. The Reverend's wife, 2 deacons, and Harvey Clemens from the general store arrived just after dark, their faces grave with purpose. "Evening, Blackwood," Reverend Matthews said when Isaiah answered their knock. "Might we come in? We have matters of some urgency to discuss." Isaiah led them to the sitting room, where the sisters waited with careful composure. The presence of the church delegation suggested moral censure, though their manner seemed more concerned than condemning. "We've heard disturbing rumors, Reverend." Matthews began without preamble. "Stories of plural marriage, of arrangements that violate both territorial law and Christian morality. We've come to offer counsel and assistance in regularizing your situation." Isaiah's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Violet spoke with quiet dignity. "What exactly are you suggesting, Reverend?" "One legal marriage, properly sanctioned by church and state, the minister replied. The other lady would need to make alternative arrangements, of course. Perhaps domestic employment elsewhere or marriage to another suitable gentleman. The suggestion hit like a physical blow. After months of building their unconventional family, the idea of separation felt like dismemberment. Rose went pale, her hands trembling in her lap. Violet's composure never wavered, but her eyes flashed with dangerous anger. "And if we refuse your counsel?" Isaiah asked quietly. Harvey Clemens leaned forward, his merchant's mind calculating consequences. "There's talk of involving territorial authorities. Questions about the legality of your land claims, your business licenses. Scandal affects the whole community, Blackwood. We're trying to help you avoid worse trouble." The threat was delicately phrased, but unmistakable. Conform or face legal consequences that could destroy everything they'd built. Isaiah felt the familiar rage that had ended his military career, the fury of watching corrupt authority crush innocent people for the sake of appearances. But it was Rose who surprised them all with her response. Standing slowly, she faced the delegation with a grace that transformed her from timid girl to dignified woman in an instant. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying surprising strength, "I appreciate your concern for our immortal souls. But I wonder if your worry might be better directed toward the banker's son, who propositious married women in broad daylight, or perhaps the saloon owner, who extends credit to men whose families go hungry, or even the territorial representative, who takes bribes to overlook mining claims that poison our water." The accuracy of her observations, gathered through careful listening during their few trips to town, left the delegation speechless. Rose continued with building confidence. "As for our arrangements, they harm no one and benefit 3 people, who might otherwise face poverty or loneliness. We work hard, pay our debts, and contribute to this community's prosperity. If that offends your sensibilities, perhaps the problem lies not with our choices, but with your narrow understanding of what constitutes Christian charity." Reverend Matthews recovered first, his face flushing with indignation. "Young woman, you cannot possibly understand the implications." "I understand perfectly," Rose interrupted, her mother's quilting needles catching the lamplight as she gestured. "I understand that your concern has less to do with morality than with maintaining appearance. I understand that you'd rather see us scattered and struggling than living peacefully in ways that don't conform to your expectations." Violet rose to stand beside her sister, presenting a united front that spoke louder than any words. Isaiah joined them, his bulk filling the space behind the women like a wall of protection. "I believe you have your answer, Reverend," Isaiah said, with quiet finality. "We'll handle our affairs according to our own conscience, not according to town gossip." The delegation departed in strained silence, leaving behind an atmosphere thick with unspoken threats. But something had shifted during the confrontation. The sisters' willingness to defend their chosen life had crystallized Isaiah's understanding of what they were building together. "That was well said," he told Rose when the visitors were gone. "I meant every word," she replied, color still high in her cheeks from the encounter. "I won't be shamed for choosing happiness over propriety." The incident had an unexpected consequence. Violet, who'd been fighting off morning sickness for a week, finally acknowledged what her body had been trying to tell her. Her monthly bleeding had ceased 6 weeks ago, and the familiar signs of pregnancy were becoming impossible to ignore. "I'm going to have a baby," she announced the next morning, her hand pressed to her still flat stomach. The news hit Isaiah like a physical blow. Maria's pregnancy had been difficult, ultimately fatal. The thought of losing another woman he'd come to love sent terror racing through his veins. "We'll need a doctor," he said immediately. "The best one we can find. Money's no object." "Isaiah," Violet said gently, recognizing his panic, "women have babies every day. I'm strong, I'm healthy. This is good news, not a disaster." But Rose saw the fear in his eyes, understood the memories that haunted him. She moved to his side, her hand finding his with instinctive comfort. "We'll take good care of her," she promised. "All of us together. Nothing will happen to Violet or the baby." The pregnancy changed everything and nothing. Their physical relationship, still tentative and carefully negotiated, took on new urgency. Violet's condition made their unconventional marriage a practical necessity rather than a moral choice. A child needed legal protection, a family name, inheritance rights, but it also raised stakes that terrified Isaiah. The investigators' interest, the community's hostility, the legal challenges, all of these threats took on mortal significance when considered against the backdrop of Violet's pregnancy. He couldn't lose another wife, another child. The very thought made his hands shake and his vision blur with remembered grief. It was Rose who proposed the solution that would define their path forward. "We need to be married immediately," she said during their evening planning session. "All of us as quickly as possible, before anyone can interfere or create legal complications." "Polygamy is illegal," Isaiah reminded her. "But marriage isn't," Rose replied with a smile that held both mischief and determination. "What if there was a way to be married that satisfied the law but preserved our family?" Her plan, when she explained, it was both audacious and practical. It would require careful timing, trusted allies, and a willingness to bend legal technicalities to their advantage. But it might work, and more importantly, it would protect the child Violet carried and the family they were all determined to preserve. The marriage plan would have to wait. 3 days after the church delegation's visit, 2 men arrived at Broken Creek just after dawn, their military bearing unmistakable despite civilian clothes. Isaiah recognized the type immediately. Career. Soldiers accustomed to authority and uncomfortable with questions. "Isaiah Blackwood?" the older man asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "I'm Captain Frank Morrison, United States Army. This is Lieutenant Hayes. We'd like a word." Isaiah stepped onto the porch, pulling the door closed behind him to keep the conversation away from his wives. "What can I do for you, gentlemen? We're investigating claims that you've been spreading false information about military operations during the Indian campaigns," Morrison said without preamble. "Serious accusations that could damage the reputation of decorated officers." "I haven't spoken to anyone about my service," Isaiah replied carefully. "I've been living quietly here for 10 years. Quietly, yes, but there's been interest lately. Journalists asking questions, stirring up old grievances." Morrison's eyes were cold, calculating. "We're here to remind you of your oath of silence regarding classified operations." The threat was politely phrased, but unmistakable. Isaiah felt the familiar anger rising in his chest. The same fury that had destroyed his military career when he'd refused to stay quiet about atrocities committed in the name of national policy. "I took no oath of silence," Isaiah said quietly. "I was discharged for conduct unbecoming, not for breaking military secrets." "Conduct unbecoming, Lieutenant." Hayes spoke for the first time, consulting a leather portfolio. "Specifically, disobeying direct orders during the engagement at Crow Creek, refusing to maintain unit discipline, abandoning your post during combat operations." The official version of events, carefully crafted lies that painted Isaiah's moral stand as cowardice and insubordination. He'd heard it all before during his court-martial, watched superior officers perjure themselves to protect a system that rewarded brutality and punished conscience. "Is that what you call it?" Isaiah asked, his voice deceptively calm. "Unit discipline?" Morrison stepped closer, his hand resting casually on the pistol at his hip. "I call it following orders, something you seem to have forgotten how to do." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of the front door opening. Rose appeared on the porch carrying a tray of coffee with the serene confidence of a woman comfortable in her own home. "Gentlemen," she said pleasantly, "you must be chilled from your ride. Please, won't you come inside for coffee?" The invitation was perfectly proper, but it also served notice. that Isaiah wasn't alone, that witnesses were present to whatever these men intended. Morrison's eyes narrowed as he took in Rose's obvious pregnancy. Violet had emerged behind her, her condition beginning to show despite loose-fitting dresses. "Thank you, Mum, but we won't be staying long," Morrison replied. His gaze flicked between the sisters with obvious calculation. 2 wives, Blackwood. Even for the frontier, that's unconventional. The comment was designed to intimidate, to remind Isaiah that his family was vulnerable to official scrutiny. But instead of backing down, Rose smiled with genuine warmth. "Oh, we're not married yet," she said cheerfully, "though we plan to remedy that soon. Isaiah's been such a gentleman, waiting for proper arrangements to be made." The innocent response deflated Morrison's implied threat, while reinforcing their commitment to each other. Isaiah felt a surge of admiration for Rose's quick thinking and steady nerve. "Well," Morrison said, clearly annoyed by the disruption to his intimidation tactics, "as I was saying, Blackwood, certain parties are concerned about your discretion regarding past events. It would be unfortunate if old stories resurfaced to embarrass good men who served their country honorably. It would be more unfortunate if the truth never came to light," Isaiah replied, his control finally slipping. "If the families of those murdered civilians never learned what really happened to their loved ones." Morrison's facade of politeness dropped entirely. "Careful, Blackwood, you're walking dangerous ground. There are consequences for spreading lies about military heroes." "Heroes?" Isaiah's voice rose with suppressed rage. "Is that what you call men who order the slaughter of women and children, who fire on white flags and burn lodges full of sleeping families?" The truth hung between them like a weapon, deadly in its simplicity. Morrison's face went white, then red with fury. For a moment, Isaiah thought the man might draw his sidearm, but the presence of witnesses, and perhaps some residual military discipline, held him in check. "You have no proof," Morrison said finally. "The official record stands. Your word against decorated officers with spotless service records." "Actually," came a voice from the barn, "he has more than his word." All eyes turned toward the speaker, a man in his 60s with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. He walked toward them with a slight limp, favoring his left leg, and Isaiah's heart nearly stopped when he recognized the face. "Colonel Marcus Driscoll," the newcomer said, extending his hand to Isaiah, "though I suppose it's just Marcus now since I retired 5 years ago." Isaiah stared at his former commanding officer, the one man who'd tried to support him during the court-martial, who'd been mysteriously transferred before he could testify on Isaiah's behalf. The colonel looked older, grayer, but his eyes held the same integrity that had made him a respected leader among his men. "Sir," Isaiah managed, accepting the handshake with hands that weren't quite steady, "I thought you were dead." "Yes, that story's been circulating for years. Convenient for certain parties who'd rather not answer uncomfortable questions." Driscoll's gaze shifted to Morrison with unmistakable contempt. "Captain Morrison, isn't it? I remember you from Fort Laramie, still carrying water for Colonel Wade, I see." Morrison had gone pale at the colonel's appearance. "Sir, I'm not sure what you think you know about these events, but—" "I know everything," Driscoll interrupted quietly. "I was there, Captain. I saw the orders Wade gave. I watched him court-martial a good man for refusing to participate in murder. He reached into his coat and withdrew a leather dispatch case, worn but carefully preserved, and I kept the documents that prove it. The military dispatch case was opened with reverent care, revealing papers that had been hidden for 15 years. Court-martial transcripts with pages mysteriously missing from the official record, witness statements that had never been entered into evidence, most damning of all, a copy of Colonel Wade's original orders. Orders that clearly authorized the killing of non-combatants in direct violation of military law. Sergeant Blackwood's account was accurate in every detail," Driscoll continued, his voice carrying the authority of absolute certainty. "He tried to prevent the massacre at Crow Creek. When that failed, he tried to save who he could. For his trouble, he was branded a coward, and drummed out of the service. Morrison's composure cracked entirely. Those documents are classified. Even possessing them is a federal crime. Is it? Driscoll's smile held no warmth. I think you'll find that war crimes don't enjoy the protection of national security classifications. The families of those murdered Cheyenne deserve justice, Captain. And they're going to get it. The revelation recontextualized everything Isaiah had believed about himself for 15 years. He wasn't a disgraced coward. He was a hero who'd been sacrificed to protect superior officers from the consequences of their crimes. The shame and self-hatred that had driven him into exile were based on carefully constructed lies. Rose moved closer to him, her hand finding his arm with gentle pressure. "You saved them," she whispered, understanding flooding her face. "You saved as many as you could." "Tried to," Isaiah managed, his voice thick with emotion. "Wasn't enough. It was everything you could do," Driscoll said firmly, "and it was more than most men would have attempted. Those children who lived because you defied orders, they have families now, descendants who owe their existence to your courage." Morrison and Hayes were backing toward their horses, clearly recognizing that their intimidation mission had backfired spectacularly. But Driscoll wasn't finished with them. "Captain Morrison," he called, his voice carrying parade ground authority. "You can tell Colonel Wade that his days of hiding behind lies are over. These documents are being turned over to the War Department's Inspector General tomorrow. Justice delayed is not justice denied." As the soldiers rode away in defeat, Isaiah sank onto the porch steps, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just been revealed. His wives flanked him, their presence anchoring him to the present as his understanding of the past shifted fundamentally. "Why now?" he asked Driscoll. "Why come forward after all these years?" "Because I'm dying," the colonel replied simply. "Cancer, the doctors say. 6 months, maybe less. I couldn't meet my maker knowing those lies were still standing unchallenged." He smiled at the sisters, his expression warming. "Besides, I heard you'd found something worth protecting again. Seemed like the right time to clear your name." Colonel Driscoll's revelation changed everything, but it also accelerated the timeline for decisions that could no longer be delayed. Word of the military investigation would spread quickly through the territory, bringing attention neither welcome nor safe for an unconventional family trying to build a quiet life. That evening, as they sat around the kitchen table with maps and legal documents spread before them, the full scope of their situation became clear. Driscoll had agreed to stay for several days, partly to rest his failing body, but mostly to help them navigate the legal and practical implications of his disclosure. "Wade won't let this stand," the colonel warned, his weathered hands steady, as he poured whiskey for the men and tea for the ladies. "He's a general now, with political ambitions. Having his war record questioned could destroy him, and he knows it. He'll fight back with everything he has." Isaiah studied the court-martial documents with fresh eyes, seeing now how thoroughly his character had been assassinated to protect his superiors. "What can he do legally? The evidence speaks for itself." "Legally, not much, but Wade's never been overly concerned with legal niceties." Driscoll's expression darkened. "He has friends in territorial government, contacts in the Justice Department. He could make your lives very difficult, especially given your domestic arrangements." Violet, her hand resting protectively over her growing belly, spoke with quiet determination. "Then we need to be legally unassailable before he has a chance to act." "My thoughts exactly," Rose agreed, rising to pace the small kitchen with nervous energy. "Isaiah, we need to discuss the marriage arrangements, not just planning them, executing them. Soon." The conversation that followed was unlike any courtship discussion in the annals of frontier romance. They spoke of legal strategy rather than emotional attachment, of protective documentation rather than wedding flowers. Yet underneath the practical considerations lay genuine affection that had been growing stronger with each shared crisis. Isaiah pulled out the ranch's deed, now amended, to include both sisters as joint owners. This protects the property regardless of what happens to me, but it doesn't protect you from charges of moral turpitude or give legal status to Violet's child. Which brings us back to the marriage question, Violet said pragmatically. 1. Legal ceremony creates legitimacy for the baby and establishes my rights as a widow if something happens to you. But what about Rose? Common law marriage, Rose said immediately. It's recognized under territorial statute after 12 months of cohabitation. We're already most of the way there. Driscoll nodded approvingly. Clever girl. That gives you legal standing without requiring formal polygamy. Wade would have a hard time prosecuting you for arrangements that technically conform to territorial law. The plan took shape over the next several hours, refined and strengthened with each discussion. They would travel to Livingston immediately for Isaiah and Violet's wedding, using her pregnancy as justification for haste. Rose would be introduced as Isaiah's ward and business partner, a temporary arrangement that would become common law marriage in due time. The legal documentation would be carefully structured to protect all their interests while avoiding obvious violation of polygamy statutes. But even as they planned, signs of gathering opposition were becoming impossible to ignore. Marcus Webb rode over the next morning with disturbing news from town. There's talk of a citizens' committee, Webb reported grimly. Kemper's been spreading stories about immoral arrangements and federal investigations. Some folk are saying you're a danger to community standards. What kind of danger? Isaiah asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. The kind that gets a man run out of town if he's not careful, Webb replied. Or worse, if emotions get heated enough. There's been talk of involving territorial marshals, maybe even federal authorities. The threat crystallized their understanding that time was running out. Whatever legal protections they could establish needed to happen immediately, before their enemies could organize effective opposition. Isaiah made his decision with the calm certainty that had once made him an effective military leader. We leave for Livingston tomorrow morning, all of us, including the colonel if he's willing. We'll be married within the week and back here before anyone realizes we're gone. And if they try to stop us? Rose asked, her chin lifting with familiar, stubborn determination. Then we go through them, Isaiah replied, his hand moving instinctively to the cavalry saber that still hung on the study wall. The weapon was more than decorative. It was a reminder of his willingness to fight for what mattered to him. That afternoon brought an unexpected visitor who clarified the stakes of their situation. Tom Mitchell, the banker's son who'd insulted. The sisters at the general store arrived with 3 companions, local men known for their quick tempers and quicker fists. Their manner was aggressive, their intentions unmistakable. Blackwood, Tom called from horseback, staying just beyond. The porch steps. We've come to make you an offer. Isaiah emerged from the house, his bulk filling the doorframe in a way calculated to remind his visitors of the physical disparity between them. Behind him, he could sense rather than see his wives and Colonel Driscoll taking defensive positions. I'm listening, Isaiah said quietly. Simple proposition, Tom continued, his voice carrying the arrogant certainty of youth and privilege. You leave Paradise Valley voluntary-like, and we forget about the irregularities in your household arrangements. Stay, and things might get unpleasant for everyone. The threat was clumsy but sincere. These weren't professional soldiers or experienced fighters. They were local boys playing at vigilante justice, dangerous precisely because of their inexperience and emotional investment in maintaining social order as they understood it. And if I refuse your generous offer? Isaiah asked, his tone deceptively mild. Then we might have to inform territorial authorities about your illegal marriages. Tom replied. About the federal investigation into your military service. About the questions surrounding your wife's moral character. The insult to Rose and Violet was calculated to provoke a violent response, and it nearly succeeded. Isaiah's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists, but before he could respond, Colonel Driscoll stepped onto the porch beside him. Young man, the colonel said with the authority of command. "You're addressing a decorated war hero and two ladies of impeccable character. I suggest you watch your tongue before someone decides to teach you proper manners." Tom's bravado faltered at the sight of the distinguished older man, but his companions murmured encouragement, and his confidence returned. "War hero, is that what you call someone who was court-martialed for cowardice? I call him someone who risked his career to save innocent lives," Driscoll replied, his voice cutting through the afternoon air like a blade. "Something you'd understand if you possessed a fraction of his courage or integrity." The confrontation escalated when one of Tom's companions, a burly ranch hand named Pete Corbin, dismounted and started toward the porch with obvious aggressive intent. "Maybe it's time someone taught this army reject some respect for his betters." Isaiah stepped down to meet him, his movement fluid and controlled despite his size. The years of ranch work had kept him strong, and his military training remained. Sharp despite disuse. When Corbin swung a wild haymaker, Isaiah sidestepped easily and responded with a precise uppercut that dropped the man like a felled tree. "Anyone else want to discuss respect?" Isaiah asked mildly, stepping over Corbin's unconscious form. The remaining men backed their horses away, their enthusiasm for confrontation significantly diminished. But Tom's parting words carried a promise of future trouble. "This isn't over, Blackwood. You've made enemies of the wrong people." As they rode away, Isaiah felt the familiar weight of impending conflict settling on his shoulders. He'd faced hostile forces before, during his cavalry service and in the years of frontier ranching. But this time, he wasn't protecting just himself. He had wives to consider, a child on the way, a future that suddenly seemed both precious and fragile. That evening, as they made final preparations for the journey to Livingston, the conversation turned to practical matters of defense and protection. Isaiah cleaned and loaded his service revolver, checking the action with the methodical care of someone who understood that weapons might soon be needed. Colonel Driscoll examined his own sidearm, an old but well-maintained Colt that had seen service in multiple campaigns. "You still remember the old drills?" Driscoll asked, watching Isaiah's weapon handling with professional interest. "Some things you don't forget," Isaiah replied, "though I hope we won't need them. 'Hope for peace, prepare for war,'" the colonel quoted. Still good advice after all these years. Rose and Violet, meanwhile, were packing with the efficiency of women who'd learned to travel light and fast when necessity demanded. Their few precious possessions were secured in carpet bags that could be grabbed quickly if rapid departure became necessary. "Are we doing the right thing?" Rose asked quietly, folding her best dress with careful attention. "Maybe we should just start over somewhere else. Running solves nothing," Violet replied, her hand moving instinctively to her belly. "This baby deserves to be born in a real home, with a real family. We found that here. I won't let ignorant men drive us away from it." Isaiah, overhearing their conversation, felt a surge of fierce protectiveness that surprised him with its intensity. These women had trusted him with their futures, their safety, their lives. He could not let them down. The decision was made. Tomorrow they would travel to Livingston for the wedding that would legitimize their family and protect their future. Whatever enemies they'd made, whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together as husband and wives, bound by law and love in equal measure. But first, they had to survive the journey. The successful defense of their wagon train created an unexpected sense of triumph, but it also underscored the urgency of reaching Livingston and formalizing their legal protections. The ambush had been amateur and poorly executed, but it demonstrated that their enemies were willing to use violence to enforce their vision of social order. They reached Livingston by evening, travel-stained and weary, but intact as a family unit. The territorial judge, a pragmatic man named Harrison, who'd seen enough frontier marriages to avoid moral judgments, agreed to perform the ceremony the following morning. The legal documentation was prepared with care, establishing Violet as Isaiah's legal wife, while carefully structuring Rose's position to avoid polygamy charges. The wedding itself was simple but profound. Standing in the judge's chambers with Colonel Driscoll as witness, Isaiah and Violet exchanged vows that carried the weight of genuine commitment rather than mere legal convenience. When the judge pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared was sweet with promise and relief in equal measure. Rose watched from beside them, her eyes bright with joy rather than jealousy. Her legal standing might be different, but her emotional position in their family was secure. The rings Isaiah had commissioned from the local blacksmith, 3 simple gold bands forged from the same piece of metal, symbolized their unbreakable connection regardless of legal technicalities. But their celebration was interrupted by news that chilled their blood and clarified the full scope of the threat they faced. A telegram from Marcus Webb brought word that federal marshals had arrived in Paradise Valley with warrants for Isaiah's arrest on charges of sedition and corruption of public morals. "General Wade's work," Driscoll said grimly, studying the telegrams. "Terse language. He's using his political connections to destroy you before the truth about Crow Creek becomes public." The charges were transparently false, but potentially devastating. Sedition could mean federal prison, the loss of their property, the destruction of everything they'd built together. Even if Isaiah were eventually exonerated, the legal process could take years and bankrupt them in the process. "What do we do?" Violet asked, her new wedding ring catching the lamplight as she clutched Isaiah's hand. "We go home," Isaiah replied, with quiet determination. "Together, and we face whatever comes." The decision to return might have seemed foolhardy, but it was based on sound strategic thinking. Running would confirm their guilt in the public mind and leave their property vulnerable to seizure. Standing their ground, with Colonel Driscoll's evidence and the community support they'd earned through years of honest dealing, offered their best chance of legal vindication. The journey back to Paradise Valley took on the character of a military movement, with Isaiah and Driscoll planning their approach with tactical precision. They would arrive openly, making no attempt to evade the federal marshals, but they would do so with documentation that exposed General Wade's war crimes and Isaiah's true character. As their wagon rolled through the familiar landscape of their valley, all 3 felt the complex emotions of homecoming mixed with uncertainty. This was their land, their home, the place where they'd found love and purpose after years of loneliness and loss. Whatever happened next, they would face it here, on ground they'd chosen and defended. The ranch buildings came into view as the sun set behind the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Smoke rose from the chimney. Marcus Webb had been caring for their stock and maintaining the property during their absence. The sight of their home, peaceful and welcoming in the evening light, strengthened their resolve to fight for what they'd built together. But the peace was temporary. Even as they approached the house, they could see riders in the distance, official figures waiting with the patience of law enforcement officers certain of their authority. The confrontation that would determine their future was at hand. Isaiah helped his wives down from the wagon, his movements calm and unhurried, despite the tension crackling in the evening air. Whatever happened next, he would face it as the man he truly was, not the coward and traitor portrayed in his military records, but the hero who'd sacrificed everything to protect innocent lives. Rose and Violet flanked him as they walked toward the house, their presence a reminder of what he was fighting for, not just his own reputation or legal standing, but the future of their unconventional family and the child who would soon be born into their love. Colonel Driscoll brought up the rear, the leather dispatch case containing 15 years of hidden truth, clutched firmly in his weathered hands. Justice had been delayed far too long, but it was finally within reach. The federal marshals were waiting on the porch, their official papers ready and their authority backed by the full power of the territorial government. But they hadn't expected to face not just Isaiah Blackwood, the disgraced ex-soldier, But Isaiah Blackwood, the war hero, supported by documentary evidence and surrounded by people willing to fight for truth. The final confrontation was about to begin. The successful defense of their wagon train created an unexpected sense of triumph, but it also underscored the urgency of reaching Livingston and formalizing their legal protections. The ambush had been amateur and poorly executed, but it demonstrated that their enemies were willing to use violence to enforce their vision of social order. They reached Livingston by evening, travel-stained and weary, but intact as a family unit. The territorial judge, a pragmatic man named Harrison, who'd seen enough frontier marriages to avoid moral judgments, agreed to perform the ceremony the following morning. The legal documentation was prepared with care, establishing Violet as Isaiah's legal wife, while carefully structuring Rose's position to avoid polygamy charges. The wedding itself was simple but profound. Standing in the judge's chambers with Colonel Driscoll as witness, Isaiah and Violet exchanged vows that carried the weight of genuine commitment rather than mere legal convenience. When the judge pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared was sweet with promise and relief in equal measure. Rose watched from beside them, her eyes bright with joy rather than jealousy. Her legal standing might be different, but her emotional position in their family was secure. The rings Isaiah had commissioned from the local blacksmith, 3 simple gold bands forged from the same piece of metal, symbolized their unbreakable connection regardless of legal technicalities. But their celebration was interrupted by news that chilled their blood and clarified the full scope of the threat they faced. A telegram from Marcus Webb brought word that federal marshals had arrived in Paradise Valley with warrants for Isaiah's arrest on charges of sedition and corruption of public morals. "General Wade's work," Driscoll said grimly, studying the telegrams. "Terse language. He's using his political connections to destroy you before the truth about Crow Creek becomes public." The charges were transparently false, but potentially devastating. Sedition could mean federal prison, the loss of their property, the destruction of everything they'd built together. Even if Isaiah were eventually exonerated, the legal process could take years and bankrupt them in the process. "What do we do?" Violet asked, her new wedding ring catching the lamplight as she clutched Isaiah's hand. "We go home," Isaiah replied, with quiet determination. "Together. And we face whatever comes." The decision to return might have seemed foolhardy, but it was based on sound, strategic thinking. Running would confirm their guilt in the public mind and leave their property vulnerable to seizure. Standing their ground, with Colonel Driscoll's evidence and the community support they'd earned through years of honest dealing, offered their best chance of legal vindication. The journey back to Paradise Valley took on the character of a military movement, with Isaiah and Driscoll planning their approach with tactical precision. They would arrive openly, making no attempt to evade the federal marshals, but they would do so with documentation that exposed General Wade's war crimes and Isaiah's true character. As their wagon rolled through the familiar landscape of their valley, all three felt the complex emotions of homecoming mixed with uncertainty. This was their land, their home, the place where they'd found love and purpose after years of loneliness and loss. Whatever happened next, they would face it here, on ground they'd chosen and defended. The ranch buildings came into view as the sun set behind the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Smoke rose from the chimney. Marcus Webb had been caring for their stock and maintaining the property during their absence. The sight of their home, peaceful and welcoming in the evening light, strengthened their resolve to fight for what they'd built together, but the peace was temporary. Even as they approached the house, they could see riders in the distance, official figures waiting with the patience of law enforcement officers certain of their authority. The confrontation that would determine their future was at hand. Isaiah helped his wives down from the wagon, his movements calm and unhurried, despite the tension crackling in the evening air. Whatever happened next, he would face it as the man he truly was. Not the coward and traitor portrayed in his military records, but the hero who'd sacrificed everything to protect innocent lives. Rose and Violet flanked him as they walked toward the house, their presence a reminder of what he was fighting for, not just his own reputation or legal standing, but the future of their unconventional family and the child who would soon be born into their love. Colonel Driscoll brought up the leather dispatch case containing 15 years of hidden truth clutched firmly in his weathered hands. Justice had been delayed far too long, but it was finally within reach. The federal marshals were waiting on the porch, their official papers ready and their authority backed by the full power of the territorial government. But they hadn't expected to face not just Isaiah Blackwood, the disgraced ex-soldier, but Isaiah Blackwood, the war hero, supported by documentary evidence and surrounded by people willing to fight for truth. The final confrontation was about to begin. 6 months later, the morning sun streamed through clean windows onto a kitchen table, where 3 coffee cups sat beside a stack of newspapers from Denver, Cheyenne, and even as far away as Chicago. The headlines told a story that had captivated the nation. War hero vindicated, military cover-up exposed, General Wade resigns in disgrace. Isaiah Blackwood sat at the head of the table, no longer the haunted exile who'd lived in solitude for 10 years, but a man at peace with his past and confident in his future. His hand rested gently on Violet's shoulder as she nursed their son, a healthy boy with his father's strong jaw and his mother's intelligent eyes. The baby had been born 2 months ago, without complication, attended by the territorial doctor and surrounded by more love than any child could reasonably expect. Rose moved between stove and table with the efficiency of long practice, her movements those of a woman completely at home in her domain. The wedding ring on her finger, identical to Violet's, caught the light as she poured coffee. Their common-law marriage had been formalized 6 weeks after the baby's birth, when the legal complications surrounding polygamy had been resolved by a territorial statute that recognized their unique circumstances. "Another letter from Washington," Rose announced, placing the official envelope beside Isaiah's plate. "Looks important." The correspondence from the War Department had been steady, since Colonel Driscoll's revelations had triggered a full investigation into the Crow Creek massacre. Isaiah's military record had been officially corrected. His discharge changed from dishonorable to honorable. His pension reinstated with 15 years of back pay. More importantly, the families of the massacre victims had finally received acknowledgement of their losses and the truth about what had happened to their loved ones. General Wade's fall from grace had been spectacular and complete. Court-martialed on charges of war crimes, perjury, and obstruction of justice, he'd been stripped of his rank and sentenced to military prison. His political career and social standing had evaporated overnight when the truth emerged about his role in covering up atrocities and persecuting the man who'd tried to prevent them. "What does this one say?" Violet asked, adjusting little Samuel's position as he dozed contentedly in her arms. Isaiah scanned the formal language with growing amazement. "They want me to come to Washington. Congressional hearing on military justice. Reform. They're asking me to testify about the importance of moral courage in the officer corps." The irony wasn't lost on any of them. The man who'd been branded a coward and traitor was now being held up as an example of heroic integrity. But Isaiah felt no bitterness about the years of exile and disgrace. They'd led him to this kitchen, this family, this profound contentment that he wouldn't trade for all the military honors in the world. "Will you go?" Rose asked, settling beside him with her own coffee. "We'll go," Isaiah corrected gently. "All of us. Samuel's old enough to travel, and I want the world to see the family that gave me reason to fight for the truth." The baby stirred at the sound of his name, opening eyes that were already showing signs of his father's piercing blue. He was a beautiful child, healthy and alert, with lungs strong enough to wake the entire household when he decided attention was required. More importantly, he was loved absolutely by 3 parents who'd found in each other the family none of them had dared hope for. Colonel Driscoll had lived to see justice done, passing peacefully in his sleep 3 months after the investigation began. His funeral had been attended by hundreds of veterans who'd served under him, and his grave in the Paradise Valley Cemetery bore a simple inscription: "He told the truth when it mattered most." His courage in coming forward had not only vindicated Isaiah, but had forced a reckoning with military practices that had protected the guilty at the expense of the innocent. The community that had once viewed their arrangement with suspicion now treated them with something approaching reverence. The story of Isaiah's heroism had transformed him from a questionable character into a local legend, and his wives were regarded as the blessed women who'd recognized his worth when the rest of the world saw only disgrace. Their unconventional marriage was now seen as romantic rather than scandalous, proof that love could triumph over social convention. Marcus Webb had stopped by the day before with news that Tom Mitchell and his companions had left Paradise Valley permanently. There, families too embarrassed by their son's behavior to remain in a community that now celebrated the man they'd tried to drive away. The general store carried newspapers that featured Isaiah's story, and tourists sometimes made the journey from Livingston just to see the ranch where the famous war hero had found redemption. But for Isaiah, the real victory wasn't public vindication or restored honor. It was the quiet morning moments like this one, surrounded by the people who'd seen past his shame to the man he truly was. Rose's gentle laughter as she read amusing passages from the newspapers. Violet's contented humming as she rocked their son. The smell of fresh bread baking and coffee brewing, and all the small domestic miracles that transformed a house into a home. "I've been thinking," Violet said, looking up from the baby with the expression that usually preceded her most practical suggestions, "about expanding the house. If we're going to keep having children, we'll need more room." "Children? Plural?" Isaiah asked with raised eyebrows, though his tone held delight rather than concern. Rose's hand moved instinctively to her still flat stomach, a gesture that spoke louder than words about the family's continued growth. "Life has a way of surprising us," she said with a smile that held mysterious promise. The photograph they'd had taken during their last trip to Livingston sat on the mantel beside Maria's portrait, not replacing the memory of Isaiah's first love, but adding to the gallery of people who'd shaped his life. In the formal pose, all 3 adults looked directly at the camera with expressions of quiet dignity and unmistakable happiness. Between them sat baby Samuel in his christening gown, the symbol of their future, and the proof that sometimes broken people could heal each other completely. As morning lengthened toward noon, and the day's work called them to barn and garden and all the endless tasks that made ranch life possible, Isaiah felt the deep satisfaction of a man who'd found his place in the world. He'd lost a family to fever and violence, lost his honor to corrupt superiors, lost years to bitterness and isolation. But in finding Rose and Violet, in building this unconventional family on the foundation of mutual respect and growing love, he'd discovered that some things lost could indeed be found again, transformed, strengthened, made more precious by the very struggles that had once threatened to destroy them. The story that began with desperate loneliness and a bargain between strangers had become something infinitely richer, a testament to the healing power of chosen family, the courage required for second chances, and the truth that love, when it finally arrives, is always worth the wait.